From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the reading and literacy promotion arm of the library. Our program today in our Books and Beyond series is co-sponsored with the Manuscript Division for reasons that will become obvious when you learn more about the topic and the resources used by our speaker. The format, well, let me go back for just a second. The series called Books and Beyond is devoted to publicizing new books which have been based, in part at least, on the collections of the Library of Congress. And our goal there, not so secret goal, is to promote the collections of the Library of Congress as a resource, but also to celebrate the fact that the result is a book. And these books are important and lasting and make an important contribution to whatever the subject or the field might be. So we do about 3 of these noontime talks a month on average, and I have put a schedule of the next presentations out on the table where our books will be sold and you may get a book for signing. Our speaker Simine will speak for 30 to 40 minutes on this wonderfully rich topic. There'll be time for questions and answers at the end, and then a book signing starting probably about 1 o'clock. Because all of the Books and Beyond presentations are videotaped for the Library of Congress's website, I want you to know that during the question and answer period, if you participate, that you are, in effect, giving us permission to use your image and wonderful ideas and questions as part of our website presentation, if the editor so decides. Because it's being filmed, I ask you to turn off all things electronic. I have 2 other things to say about the Center for the Books program, and then I will introduce our speaker. In addition to state centers for the book around the country that work with us to promote books and reading, often by promoting writers and libraries in those states, and state literary heritage and state book awards and state author programming is very much a part of that. We have another network of nonprofit organizations with whom we work to promote books and reading. And that has actually been part of the background for the development of the National Book Festival, which I hope you know about, which was brought to the Library of Congress by Laura Bush. The first one was in 2001. And Mrs. Bush had created a Texas Book Festival, which benefited the Texas public libraries. And once her husband was elected, she announced, without asking the Library of Congress, which I think was just fine, that she wanted to go national, and she wanted the Library of Congress to be her partner in the creation of a National Book Festival. And we are now in our 12th year, and the Center for the Book plays a key role, and I'm fortunate enough to be the author coordinator, so I am always on the look for authors and writers and potential people that we can use either in Books and Beyond program or at the National Book Festival. Secondly, these talks continue on the Center for the Book's Facebook page, where we have a record of the previous talks and also a chance for people online to discuss and ask questions. And we hope for our authors to also participate. So there is a lasting value to not only the videotapes that we make for these talks, but also the videotapes for the National Book Festival. So if you go to the Library of Congress's website, you're going to find really quite a wonderful snapshot of American literature. I normally don't start by reading from our own press release for a talk, but I am going to in this instance because it's become very clear to me, and I have not yet read the book, but I will. But in looking at the book, it is such a rich resource that covers so many different fields of interest that I thought I would open with what our communications officer selected to highlight as a general description of this presentation and of this wonderful job of research. French-born, and the press release goes, engineer who inspired Wright brothers is subject of a book discussion. Octave Chanute was a designer of aeronautics, bridges, and stockyards. French-born and self-trained civic engineer Octave Chanute, 1832 to 1910, designed America's two largest stockyards, created innovative and influential structures such as the Kansas City Bridge over the previously unbridgeable Missouri River, and was a passionate aviation pioneer whose collaborative approach to aeronautical engineering problems encouraged other experimenters, including the Wright brothers. Simine is going to talk a little bit about the resources of the Library of Congress, and we're so pleased that she was able to take the time to be here. Simine is a retired chemist. She tells me she worked for 11 years as a chemist, retired in 2005 from the Aragon National Laboratories in Chicago. She is an aviation historian, and you will hear a little bit about her research, focusing on the history of motorless flight. Her first book, Glider Mail, an Aerophilatelic Handbook, received numerous research awards worldwide and is now considered a standard reference handbook. I am very pleased to present to you Simine Short for her presentation on Locomotive to Aeromotive. Please help me welcome her.
I would like to fill you in some of the details about this man who many people say was a French person, but as far as I can tell, he was a true American who just happened to have been born in France. Because some of us do consider ourselves Americans once we are in this country. But some of you may not know who Chanute is, and it took me a little while what made this man tick, and I thought I'd show you the one thing that I found most fascinating. You all know the Capitol, United States Capitol. And over here underneath that is a painting. And the last painting in the rotunda is the Birds of Flight, which shows, of course, Orville and Wilbur Wright. But the three men beside it is Leonardo da Vinci, Samuel Langley, and Octave Chanute. Now, I questioned myself, how did Chanute be selected to be shown on that frieze as one of the special people of the United States? And how did he become the pivotal person in the quest for mechanical flight and be the inspiration to so many budding aeronautical engineers and pioneers? And I hope by the end of my presentation you agree with me, he was an outstanding man. And if you don't agree, then buy the book. Chanute decided that he wanted to become a civil engineer, and he started his unpaid apprenticeship in 1948. It wasn't quite sure that he was capable as a 16-year-old to actually do any efficient work. Therefore, the chief engineer of the Hudson River Railroad said, okay, you can come, but work for free. 3 months later, he was hired for a little more than $1. In 1853, the 21-year-old civil engineer moved to Illinois. His first job was laying out the line from Joliet to Lake Station in Indiana to connect with the Michigan Central. The next one was helping survey what later became the Chicago Alton. And then 2 years later, he was hired as a chief engineer to help survey and build the road from Peoria to the Indiana state line. But Chanute also knew if he wanted to become famous, and that was always something that was in the back of his mind, he had to accomplish something. And therefore he looked for projects that were a little bit above what he was familiar with doing. And when the proposal was looked for to build a stockyard in Chicago, he submitted his design, and it was the best out of 14 submitted ones. And he built the yard just south of the Chicago city limits. He built in, because he needed water for the stockyards, he put in a dam that brought fresh water into the stockyards and wastewater back into the South Branch. Now, 30-some years later, that part of the Chicago River became known as Bubbly Creek. But I don't think that Chanute had the idea that things would be a lot rougher than he had intended in 1865. And that's what the stockyards looked like in about 1868. And it was a huge stockyard that got bigger and bigger. The gates are now closed, but the whole yards are closed, but the gate that Bonham and Wood designed in the early 1870s, it's still there. But I have not seen it yet because my husband said this is not an area that I like to go to. Therefore, I'm using somebody else's photo. But one of these days, I will go take a look. The next big job that Chanute wanted to do is do the impossible. Boston investors had been part of the railroad that he put between Peoria and the Indiana state line, and they mentioned that they wanted to have uninterrupted rail traffic to go from Boston and the East Coast to California. The Transcontinental Railroad was working and functioning. However, you always had to take the ferry to get from one side of the Missouri to the other side of the Missouri. And therefore, it wasn't really truly a complete transcontinental railroad. But Boston investors like Forbes and James Joy, they wanted a bridge across the Missouri so that they would be the first one. Chanute was hired for $5,000 a year, which at that time a carpenter made about $1 a month. That's what the bridge looked like 4 years later. And I've always found it kind of interesting that progress in anything was shown with lots of smoke, like from the steamers or from mills. Polluting the air apparently was like progress. And also the two engineers that worked with Chanute, Joseph Tomlinson from England and George Morrison from Boston, who joined Chanute in building the bridge across the Missouri at Kansas City. And Chanute always wanted to make sure that nobody can say he builds ugly bridges just because they were roughly made. Therefore, you can see how he put some decoration up in the top just to beautify his work. And what he also did, the stone piers that the bridge is resting on, he found some blue limestone. And therefore, the side that is close to where the river comes down is covered with blue stone that kind of glistened a little bit. He was very proud of that. Of course, newspapers all across the country were fascinated, and this one from Lawrence, Kansas, said, "All things considered, this bridge is the most splendid triumph of engineering genius of the age, and imperishable renown has been won by Mr. O. Chanute." There were lots of different newspapers, and they all thought that was absolutely fascinating how anybody could bridge the unbridgeable river. But once the bridge was built, you needed railroads. And therefore, Chanute's next job was to build the railroads to bring in money. Because if you don't have any railroads that go over the bridge, well, then you don't have money. And I thought I show you this map of eastern Kansas, and you will see one railroad here and another here, but all this area here, there were no railroads. But people also discovered that down here at the Indian Territory in Kansas and Texas, that's where the cattle came from. Therefore, Chanute put in 2 railroads going south, the Fort Scott to Kansas City, and then the other one to Lawrence, and then the last one up here from Atchison to Nebraska. All these railroads supplied commerce. And once you have the railroad, people are moving in. And when people are moving in, money comes in. And therefore it's just a vicious circle. One goes in hand with the other. The locomotives required not only fuel, like wood, but they also required water, because the locomotive cannot run without the cooling water and the steam. Therefore, Chanute not only built water tanks that actually did not freeze anymore, but he also built up windmills, because the water had to be pulled out of the ground. And then I was wondering, there are not too many photos, and I wanted a picture of a bridge that Chanute built. But how do I find a picture if it's not in the Chanute collection? Therefore, somebody in this happy family, like, I don't want to point fingers at anybody, said, "Do you know that the Library of Congress has railroad maps?" I said, "Yeah." "Do you know they also have panoramic maps?" "No." "Well, then why don't you take a look?" Therefore, I looked for all the cities that Chanute built anything, and I found Ottawa, the largest city of its age in Kansas in 1872. Chanute built this bridge. Chanute built the railroad station and the roundhouse, the water tower, and the windmill. Therefore, thank you, Library of Congress, I had a picture. Chanute left the west to head east because somehow the commerce was just not coming in with the climate, and people didn't come in. And he joined the Erie as a chief engineer. The Erie was an old railroad, started going back to the early 1850s, but none of the equipment had been updated since. And after 30-some years, the equipment needed replacing and updating and improving. And Chanute thought that this was really a good opportunity to use what he learned and learn more. And when the wooden bridge at what is now Letchworth State Park burned down, he came up with a new design, and he worked with George Morrison to get the bridge built. The picture on the left-hand side is the old bridge, wooden bridge that was built in the 1850s, and then the new one over the same general area. And I should say, this state park is probably one of the prettiest one in Letchworth State Park in New York State. And my father-in-law was the garden designer and laid out the park. And therefore, that park means something to me. Another thing that Chanute was quite involved with is rapid transit and the terminal freight facilities in New York City. He and the four other people were on a committee in late 1874 to determine what's the most efficient way to supply transportation to the New Yorkers. Almost a year later, they submitted their final proposal, and a year later they started building the elevated lines. And then New Yorkers complained, just like the Chicago people, about the L, that it was too noisy. And the next one was rapid transit underground, and then that was built in early 1900, and again Chanute was one of the consulting engineers. The most impressive event probably in Chanute's career were the strikes that happened over and over again. And he believed firmly that strikers had a right also, because even though they were fighting for more money, what came from the railroads, the strikers had to live also. And therefore he was frequently on the side of the strikers and as an intermediate person with management. The Great Strike of 1877 was probably the most memorable that Chanute also participated in. And that started on a Friday late in the evening. Chanute was in a summer residence. The head of the Erie sent a train out to get Chanute out of bed at 2 o'clock in the morning to come to New York and then go take care of matters at Hornell. And I believe that the Erie thought, as long as Chanute had been working in Kansas with the Indian trouble and the settler trouble there, he should know how to handle whatever problems they are encountering here. And I just show you a couple pictures. That's the train that brought Chanute and his people then from New York to Corning, where they picked up the military. And then in Hornellsville, that's where the strikers were really having a gave the railroads a difficult time. Because there were mountains all over, they soaked the railroad tracks. That means nobody could leave Hornell. And when they couldn't succeed, then they just turned the engines over. And again, the military had to erect the engines again. And that strike was much in his memory, but it was a response to the wage cuts and other grievances, but also the dominance, and some people call it the snobbishness, of the railroads as part of American life and commerce. And Chanute's management skill was really tested at that particular strike. But the fun parts were that Chanute could play with improvements to the railroad. He developed a special locomotive with 16 wheels. He introduced the third rail, so because the Erie had a wide rail system, but all the other railroads had the regular standard railroad system, and then they couldn't drive on the railroad tracks and didn't bring in money. Therefore, as he was progressing to get locomotives to be all on the standard way, he put in a third rail to compensate for both. Uniformity in hardware. Anything that went into building a locomotive was like a prototype. He had 30 engines built. None of the parts of the 30 engines actually fit into each other. And he got very frustrated, but being just one person didn't really allow him to do what he wanted to do. But because he was a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers, he had friends in the society, and again, a committee was established. Oh, that's how, just some of the samples of how the threads were, the different varieties of thread. And then working with other people, sharing knowledge, and especially working with the Pratt Whitney Company, they determined how to make screws all the same way, so that if the Industrial Revolution wants to continue and grow, everything has to be the same. You cannot have a 10-20, a quarter 20 bolt with a 21 threads to the inch. It just doesn't go. You got to do all the same. And it worked, and Chanute was one of the people who pushed for it and succeeded. The various forces of nature always were a puzzle to Chanute. And the Kindle Bridge in Pennsylvania was just such a challenge. And he worked with his friend Thomas C. Clark, incorporating the wind, the action of the heavily loaded train, because that has a little fluctuation on a bridge, and of course the characteristics of the metal and the final structure. The bridge was built in about 3 months, and I find this bridge fascinating, and therefore it's the same one that is also on the front of my book. And you can see how the guys having fun, showing off, just dangling, of course, without a harness or anything. Surprisingly, only 3 people got killed. I mean, I find it amazing. That bridge was for almost a decade the tallest and the longest railroad bridge in the world. And it was impressive. A tornado destroyed part of the bridge in 2003. And the inspectors found that the bolts that are holding the piers into the cement pedals had rusted out, that Chanute were put in under Chanute's time. After 120 years, they should have replaced the bolts earlier. But for Chanute and for many of the civil engineers, the actual engineering is the art of directing the great sources of power in nature and apply those forces of nature to the benefit of mankind. And again, Chanute puzzled about the forces of nature, and also how it could be applied to the convenience of man, especially a flying machine. His first manuscript was written in 1878. I still don't know what the clover leaf means that he painted or that he drew on the top of the page. But the manuscript was never published, and I'm not sure if it was not published because he wasn't quite ready to have it publicized, or if he was a little bit concerned that people make fun of him, that he is involved with this thing that you shouldn't be talking about. Flight was a no-no, because if God wanted you to fly, he would have given you wings. And we know it didn't, and therefore you shouldn't be. That's almost like cranks do that only. And therefore, again and again, he put flying and a man-carrying flying machine to the side. He retired from the Aerie and from the rat race of being in New York City and the Aerie. And Chanute joined forces with Joseph Court and directed the first commercial type preserving works in Las Vegas. And having the plant, always thinking of improvements, Chanute discovered that the wood frequently cracks when it is drying, and therefore he saw in Germany how people used S-clamps in the ties to keep them together. And therefore he introduced them in the United States. He also knew that most of the wood is being floated on rivers or lakes. Therefore it's soaked up with water. Well, if the wood is soaked up with water, the chemicals can penetrate. Therefore, he figured out how to dry the wood so that then the chemicals can go in. And the final thing that he did, you can barely see it, is the date nails. And here's the one from 1899, because he wanted to make sure that the big railroad ties are just wooden sticks. They all look alike. There's nobody that can say, I'm the one that preserved it, or you're the one. The only way to do it is mark it with those date nails, which would actually tell anybody that it was his preserving, and it was his preserving done in 1899. And therefore it's good record keeping that didn't cost that much. Just thought you'd like to see a picture of Chanute and his wife Annie. It was taken probably in the late 1880s, and that's courtesy of the Chanute family. It's not at the Library of Congress yet, but I'm working that this gets donated here too, but we see. Always looking for something new to challenge the brain and the mind, Chanute decided that aeronautics would be his next engineering challenge. But there was nothing written up that was worthwhile, and he didn't really know who knew what, and the only way to find out what was going on is to start a conversation and correspondence with a variety of people. And because it was still a matter of, it's something you don't talk about. And therefore he decided to talk about flying and the possibility that it could possibly be done to professional societies. And as he was a prestigious, eminent engineer whom people looked up to, therefore people started to believe that maybe one could talk about it and maybe we could spend a little more time on it. Therefore, that was just a breakthrough to get people involved, because Chanute believed firmly that not one person alone can do it. You have to mix up different opinions and come up with a solution. He prepared 27 articles for the recently published Railroad and Engineering Journal that his friend Matthias Forney had published, and then these articles were put into the book Progress in Flying Machine, and it became a must-read for anybody that wanted to know anything about flight or aeronautics. But in this book he also formalized some of the terminology that is still being used today, like aeroplane, aeronautical engineer, and lift and drag, but drag is now replaced with another word. Attending the fair in Paris in 1889, Chanute liked the idea that they used a disposable scheme. All buildings were torn down and taken away without having anything left. And the Chicago group wanted to have a World's Fair in 1892. Therefore, they asked Chanute and Edward Jeffrey to go to Paris, come up with whatever information they have, and then report to the Chicago group how to prepare the World's Fair without costing too much. That's the mining building under construction. It's just regular wood construction. And then plaster was added, and that's what the building looked like at the fair. And everybody knows the White City, as it was then inviting visitors to come. Chanute's philosophy had always been that engineers owe it to themselves to acquaint others with whatever new facts they may have acquired outside of the routine of their profession, provided that they always stick accurately to the facts. Because the only way to learn is to share with others. Chicagoans decided they had to outdo Paris, and they wanted a stunning tower that was way better than the Eiffel Tower in Paris. So Chanute was one of the people of the member of the Western Society of Civil Engineers. They convinced the city politicians that the Ferris wheel is a tower. You just bend it around and connect it. And as we know, the Ferris wheel was a superb success because nobody had ever done that before. Another thing that was kind of going on at that time is rapid transit in Chicago was still something that left a little bit to be desired. You had the carriages and horse-drawn carriages, but really nothing efficient. Therefore, Chanute and one of the other people, two other people, came up with a movable, like a railway, and that's the one that then brought visitors from the pier to the White City. And again, people enjoyed riding on that a lot. During the World's Fair, the engineers also wanted to have an engineering congress. And because engineers were still not considered equal to par to lawyers or doctors, Chanute decided if he becomes vice chairman of the World's Congress Auxiliary and the president of the General Committee of Engineering Society, he can attend all the meetings in Chicago and convince everybody that engineers do know what they're doing and he can contribute. And he succeeded because more than 300 engineers from around the world came and attended the Engineering Congress in August of 1893. And I thought the last statement in that newspaper clipping is on Chanute of the General Committee welcomed the delegates. And he had his name in every newspaper clipping, always making sure that engineers all know what they are doing. And one of the sub-congresses was an aerial navigation conference. And this article is kind of cute. where it then said, Mr. Octave Chanute presided with grace and dignity. Keep in mind, aviation was still a little tacky. And Chanute, in his opening address, said, it is well to recognize from the beginning that we have met here for a conference about an unusual subject, one in which commercial success is not yet to be discerned, and in which the general public, not knowing of the progress accomplished, has little interest and still less confidence. But during that Congress, the subject of aeronautic was cleared of much rubbish, to use Chanute's words, and was no longer considered an obsession of cranks. Scientists and engineers with a vision were now working on solving the problem. Watching the seagulls perform soaring flight brought more questions. How do they turn in flight? And Chanute knew from the railroad that you had to raise the outer rail and put a brake on the wheel of the inner rail to go around at a higher speed the fastest you can. So, not knowing any different, he made the assumption that this is exactly how the future airplane would also do it. The Wrights did it a few years later the right way. But Chanute was convinced that the natural laws require mental accuracy, and you have to be accurate all the time. And the last sentence was basically saying exactly what Chanute had in mind. We need to bring the minds together. Men need to meet one another and profit by the interchange of ideas. That's the only way to succeed. Chanute began corresponding with Moulliard in Egypt in 1890. 2 years later, Moulliard built the plane and a glider, and they applied for a patent on a flying machine. And one of the claims was how to turn in flight. And because Chanute was very much part of it, that turning and flight was just like like a locomotive on an elevated track, applying a brake to one wing. Again, the Wrights did that better a few years later. But he also determined that aviation consists just more than out of just one single problem. He knew there were 10 separate problems, and each one of them had to be logically followed through and then combined into one. And these are the 10 points that he felt was an absolute necessity. And he wrote them down in December of 1893. And for him, the most important one in the development was number 7, the maintenance and keeping a stable equilibrium. In June of 1896, Chanute and his and a team that consisted from his son Charlie, Bill Avery, Paul Butisov, and Augustus Herring, and they went to the dunes at Millis, and then a little bit later in the dunes, which is in Dune Park. They experimented first with the Lilienthal design that Herring had originally built, because Chanute knew from his railroad experiences that he had to validate the work done by others to separate fact from error, and only then could he venture into the unknown and discover the unanticipated. The Lilienthal glider did fly, not to the best of the performance, but it was airborne, and the local newspaper reporters were just absolutely amazed. But the Lilienthal glider was just not flying like it should be. Chanute didn't like the body shifting. He believed that automatic stability had to be there, otherwise the airplane could not be flown successfully. He only wanted the pilot to intervene to change the direction. His multiplane was put together next, and because the glider didn't work the way it should be, Chanute altered the glider's architecture in a step-by-step process using gliding flight as a guide and releasing feather downs in front of the machine so that he could see how the path of air would go over the wings. This picture comes from the Library of Congress, but I could not understand how all this contraption of wings actually looked like an airplane. And therefore a friend of mine interpreted so that I can understand what the glider actually looked like. But you can see then now they took out the wings in the front, had 2 in the middle and 4 as a tail section. And now you have 5 in the middle and 1 in the back. And here's another one in flight. And in his diary, he said, found the katydid quite steady and manageable. Took scores of glides. The rear wings flex up behind in flight and preserve the fore and aft balance. They seem to be in the right place, and I'm well satisfied that this is the type to adopt for rebuilding. A little more than a month later, they came back with a new design, and we don't have any pictures, but the new design was a triplane, and you can see from the little list here how the 3 surfaces actually look like. And you also know now that the bottom surface has less of a the manhole was in the middle. Therefore, we know that this is how the triplane must have looked like. But the bottom wing always got caught in the sand, and it became the biplane, which is then the breakthrough of finding a stable glider that could actually be used without any trouble. And again, newspaper reporters were there, and the one from the Chicago Tribune was absolutely amazed how Herring rose with a sudden gust 40 feet higher than a starting point, then coming to a sudden poise, balancing like a bird, swooping at a right angle, traveled a long journey, about 340 feet, and alighted gracefully upon a hillside. This primitive biplane weighed 23 pounds and had 135 foot wing area. But it became the starting point for many other wannabe pilots and aeronautical engineers. But Chanute always had in mind that this flying is a sport. And he wrote in 1903 that some of our dauntless automobile sportsmen will happen to make themselves some similar machines and seek out somewhere a favorable spot for competing in these glides. And this picture was actually taken in 1897, but you can see all the people here, and these are all members of the Western Society of Engineers and newspaper reporters, and Herring and the people that Chanute had hired. I thought Chanute's statement in 1899 in a popular magazine was kind of cute, that the flying machine of the 20th century will be analogous to a sailing vessel with an auxiliary screw. This is the prospect indeed that makes flying worthwhile to search for. It is the effortless soaring of the condor, not the fussy flapping of the sparrow, that must be taken as a model. And Chanute shared his knowledge freely to anyone because he was hoping that somebody would help him come up with a solution and work with him to solve this century-old problem. You all have seen and heard of the famous letter that Wilbur wrote to to Chanute. And many of you probably haven't seen the response of Chanute that he wrote almost a week later. But he then said, in closing, I shall be glad to have you call on me and can perhaps better answer the questions that have occurred to you. And in closing his letter, if you don't expect to come to Chicago, I will be pleased to correspond with you further and to have a more detailed account of your proposals. And being elected in 1901 as president of the Western Society of Engineers, He encouraged budding engineers to join the Western Society because he believed that by asking questions, you will learn. And when Chanute was invited to go and visit the Wrights in 1901, he watched their 1901 glider, which really didn't behave like they had anticipated. So he asked Wilbur Wright to come and lecture to the Western Society of Engineers as well. And we all know that the preparations for this talk and the discussion at that meeting were, for all practical purposes, the breakthrough in their career. And I'm very glad that Chanute took an active part in making it happen. We all know December 17, and when they telegraphed home, Catherine wired to Chanute, and for a while he was the only one outside of the family who knew about the Wright's successful flight. The boys report 4 successful flights today from level against 21-mile wind, and then repeating what the telegraph said. And of course, Chanute went to the telegram office right away, and by that time it was about 9 o'clock in the evening. Immensely pleased at your success. When you're ready to make it public, please advise me. And he also wrote a very nice note to Catherine because he was tickled pink. In 1904, the World's Fair took place in St. Louis. They had hoped for lots of flying machines to be participating, and nothing really happened. So Avery suggested to build a new biplane glider. And because there was no hill to launch, Chanute invented the first electric winch. That's what the winch looks like. And for those of you who are glider pilots, that's how a glider looks like after winch launch. And it was just, the crowds were absolutely amazed. That lasted about 3 weeks, and then the tow line broke, just like in glider operation today. And he landed a little hard, tore a few tenons, broke 2 ribs of the glider, and once he could walk again, he fixed the 2 ribs, and the glider was sold to France for $300. The Wrights also heard about the experiment in St. Louis, on the flying in St. Louis, and Wilbur then asked Chanute to come and stop in and see them fly later in October 1904. This picture is not from the flight that Chanute witnessed. This was taken a few weeks later, but I don't think there was too big of a difference between the airplanes. After the successful flights at Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers went their own way, and they worked in secret at improving their flying machine, and the previous fruitful relationship with Chanute cooled. And the ever-vocal press soon coined it the Chanute-Wright controversy, or Wright-Chanute controversy. Researching Chanute, I wanted to know, what is this Chanute-Wright controversy? Is it for real, or what's going on? And Len said, read the letters that are on the website, because here you see the letters handwritten. It's not like McFarland who edited them a little bit and then printed it, but read the actual handwriting. And I have to say, I don't quite see it to be a controversy. I think it was just 2 people or 3 people starting to go their own way, this way and that way, and sometimes there was one getting a little older and the other one a little successful, then you run into problems. I think that's very normal, it's very human, and I don't see that to be as a controversy. But it's discussed in my book because everybody said you have to discuss it. I don't see quite a reason for it because I think it's just a normal human development. Chanute talked about aviation in 2009. He believed that the next development will be the utilization of air currents to fly, as do the soaring birds, without the action of motors, save that of the wind. And it is an easy matter to find the wind currents, and I think as soon as man begins to utilize them, there will be another great step made in the development of flying. Having studied birds in flight and watching them, achieved soaring flight, Chanute compiled his last research paper on the topic that he liked the most, soaring flight and how to perform it. Because most people, just like today, don't really know what soaring is all about, he explained that the soaring or sailing flight of certain varieties of large birds who transport themselves on rigid, unflapping wings in any desired direction. And you perform soaring flight by circling like the bird in your glider. You rise spirally like the bird, and you steer with a horizontal rudder so as to descend slightly when going with the wind and to ascend when going against the wind. And once altitude is gained, progress can be made in any direction. And that's a modern way of looking what soaring flight is today. You spiral up, you glide to the next normal, you spiral up. After Chanute died on 1910 in November, many people wrote eulogies, and the one from Hudson Maxim I personally liked the best. Chanute was always, in all things, a vedette of progress. He was one of those whom duty sent far to the fore, where unaided and lonesome they make their landmarks, begging their fellows to follow and move further on. And the world comes up then, and not until then, are their landmarks seen to be true and their labor found to be worthwhile. Always it has been a devoted few who have stood in the vanguard and fought the hard fight of progress. One of such few was Chanute. He belonged to the true nobility of brains. And the Society of Western Engineers erected a plaque in 1936 to the father of aviation, who made the first successful flights in a heavier-than-air craft from the dunes east of Gary, and this boulder was dedicated in his memory. And in closing, I would like to mention my little advisory committee: Al Bowers from the Edwards Air Force Base, Len Bruno, whom you all know from the Manuscript Division, Gary Bradshaw, who is professor of psychology at Mississippi State, Tom Crouch from the Air and Space Museum, Kevin Kochersberger first from the Rochester Institute of Technology, now from Virginia Tech, Jeff Oakes, professor of computer science but specialist in wood preservation at University of Indianapolis, Dave Young, the retired editor of transportation section from the Chicago Tribune, Joe Hodges, probably one of the few remaining members of the Chanute family who helped a great deal coming up with some personal information, and of course my husband Jim Short and our dog Numa. That's it.
Well, Simine, thank you for a wonderful presentation, and I feel that I not only have learned a lot, but I've learned about your work and your generosity of spirit, and I've never had a speaker put pictures of their advisory board up, and that's really quite wonderful. We do have a few minutes before the book signing. The books are here. I went out to check for a couple of questions, and then we will just be happy to move out to the book signing. Are there questions? Connie or Len, you must have observations you'd like to make.
I was just thrilled with your presentation, and I have many times been to the Capitol, and I never realized that Chanute was up there on the frieze. And it was nice of you to show the picture, because I wondered, it looks sort of like a parking garage here. And I was delighted that you told us what it actually was and showed the picture.
Yeah. Well, actually, when I came, I found out about this picture by accident. As I was looking for something to work into the book, I went to the website, the counterpart of the Library of Congress in Germany. And I Googled Chanute, and there it says he's in the frieze of the United States Capitol. Well, I Googled a little bit more and told Len, how do I know? What is this really true? And he gave me the contact of the architects of the Capitol, and I contacted them. Yes, it is true. And then I said to Tom, have you ever heard of that? No, but let me look. But then I decided this to me is so outstanding. It has to be in the front, and it gave a perfect introduction to the book.
Fabulous.
And the picture that I have is actually prettier, but the publisher didn't want to go in color. Yes, sir.
Yeah, in your research, did he ever get a sense of just what this would mean in terms of transportation
Would you repeat the question? Just yeah.
on a whole? Like he had some pretty basic ideas about lift and soaring, but did he have any sense of, did he live long enough to have any sense that it might be used in the way that it was for transportation?
Chanute was, the question is if the flying machine as a means of transportation would be in the future.
Did he have a sense?
Yes. I believe Chanute wanted to make sure that every aspect of transportation can be made useful to mankind. He didn't do too much development of the steamers across the ocean, but he always wanted to be on the fastest boat that crossed the ocean going from Europe back to the United States and vice versa. He was very much a part of building and developing locomotives and railroads that go faster and faster and carry bigger and bigger load. He was quite sure that the airplane would open a new horizon, but he didn't think that it would be like what it is now. But he also wasn't sure, as a civil engineer, you had to develop a machine that uses the forces of nature. He didn't quite believe that installing an engine is really the solution. He believed that you have to use the forces of nature to develop a flying machine that is all-purpose. And I believe that he believed that it's a sport. It's not as much a means of transportation. He actually thought that a glider was very much like a sailing boat, like sailing, racing, and therefore the glider would be just the same way. Does that answer your question?
Two more questions.
Okay.
Yes, and then Len. Yeah.
You mentioned that he had correspondence with the Wright brothers. To what extent did Chanute have correspondence with Samuel Langley doing very similar?
Oh, those two were buddies.
The question was about Langley.
The question was about correspondence between Chanute and Langley. And fortunately, the letters that Chanute wrote to Langley are all copied in his letterpress box. Chanute was very finicky, I don't know for a better word. Every letter that he wrote was copied into a copy press book. And fortunately, except for 2 or 3, they're all here at the Library of Congress. And somebody had this brilliant idea to have them converted to microfilm, because a microfilm was available for interlibrary loan. The letterpress books are not. And that's how I went through I think it's 32 microfilms. I had borrowed them one after the other in the 10 years of research. But the letters to Langley were very professional. Like with the Wrights, it's a little bit more on a little bit more friendly, human way, but with Langley, it is very professional. And some of the letters that Langley wrote are also here at the Library of Congress, and therefore that's one of my next projects, to see how does Langley fit in the overall scheme.
For the last question, I'm going to call on Len Bruno, a member of the advisory committee, for the last word. Len?
This guy.
Well, it's not a question. I just want to say that the Wrights and Chanute corresponded for 10 years, from 1900 to 1910. And Simine benefited from a unique situation here at the library. We have the dialogue. We have both sides of the correspondence. Often when a researcher comes to a institution like this, to use the Chanute papers, they'll have all the incomings. In other words, what the Wrights sent to them, what happened to his outgoings. In this case, all of his outgoings are in the Wright collection, although Chanute did keep copies of everything himself. So she benefited from the richness of our holdings. Obviously, productive time that Simine spent here, and she was one of the hardest researchers I've ever encountered. Indefatigable, it's not even
Yeah, but I also had a friend. Len said, if you have a question, I don't have time to search, but if you tell me where it is, then I can make you a copy. And I knew that from the finding aid, box number so-and-so in the oversize has a collection of the development of the St. Charles Bridge. I said, Len, can you just take a look? Or there was one letter from from an Austrian researcher. His name was Kress, and he wrote in the old-fashioned German way, beautiful handwriting, except many people today can't even read it. And Chanute couldn't read it either. And therefore, but he had some other engineer then translate it, and because it's translation, I am always a little hesitant to repeat it because it's secondary research. So I asked Len, do you have the letter from the 5th of May? Can you just make me a copy? And he came back and said, nobody can read that. But it worked good, and I did find a few things that were translated wrong, at least in my opinion, being German.
Well, thank you. And let's, before we move to the book signing and sales outside, let's give Simon Short another round of applause for a wonderful talk. Thank you. It was very good.
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.